Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeo Viking. Today is the 8th video in my Origins of Modern East Asia series. The subject of today's video is the Tokugawa Shogunate, specifically the 250 years of peace that was ushered in by its creation, a time period that began with the Tokugawa victory at the Battle of Sekigahara and ended with the expedition by U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry, who would open up Japan to the rest of the world and end its 250-year period of relative isolation from the rest of the world. So, like all the other countries in this series, China, Mongolia, Korea, whenever in our modern minds and our modern world we hear the name Japan, we think of Japan as it is now, as you see on this map. And of course, this is not an incorrect way to think about it. This is how we've known about it for around 150 years or so, give or take. But it's also not the full picture. In order to understand the full picture of how Japan got this way, which it got this way through a variety of different steps and stages, in order to understand that, we have to go back a little further in the past to get a better look at the bigger picture. So, with that, we're going to start with the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu. So Tokugawa Ieyasu was one of dozens to hundreds, depending on the time period you're looking at, of what are known as daimyos, or it's hard to translate it. Some call them feudal lords, some call them governors, some call them military leaders, petty kings. All could fit, but he was one of these very powerful regional rulers known as daimyo during a period of large-scale civil war in Japan known as the Sengoku Jidai, or the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period. And this was a time period where all these various daimyos, these various regional rulers, were fighting over rule of Japan with each other. The idea was the hope that eventually one of these daimyo, whether it be the Tokugawa clan, the Chosakabe clan, the Hojo clan, what have you, would eventually come out on top and become what is known as shogun, or the de facto ruler of Japan. It was during this time period that Tokugawa Ieyasu would become the ally and essentially vassal of two much more powerful daimyos. The first being Oda Nobunaga, who would sort of rise from obscurity. He started off as the ruler of a lesser known clan, of a smaller clan. The Oda clan was not very powerful, but once he took power, he really began to expand the Oda power base and began to try to unify Japan. And of course, this included making alliances with other daimyo, such as Ieyasu, the Tokugawa clan, Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. And he would actually make, with the help of Tokugawa Ieyasu and other allied daimyos, he would actually make quite a lot of victories and see quite a lot of success. However, for those of you who saw my video on Sengoku Jidai, you will know, and those of you who don't know, Oda Nobunaga would not live to see the unification of Japan. He would actually be assassinated by one of his generals, only for his goal, his vision of Japan being united, to be inherited by one of his top general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Ieyasu was one of his top generals, but Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the cream of the crop. And of course, Ieyasu would hitch his wagon to Toyotomi Hideyoshi as well. And eventually, this goal of reunification of Japan that was started by Oda Nobunaga would be finished by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, ending with the complete reunification of Japan. And it was during this reunification and after this reunification that Tokugawa would really begin to increase his power base. He would start off in 1591 CE by moving from his original Tokugawa power base, more towards the center of Japan, and would move the Tokugawa clan's power base from that region to the Kanto region over here, where that was in a region that was formerly held by the Hojo clan. And during this move, he would make an old a sort of dilapidated castle, a castle that had been neglected at least to a point, Edo, and he would make Edo Castle his power base. And of course, in doing this, he would rebuild Edo Castle, show it love and care, if you will, and would heavily fortify it. And it was because of this sort of isolation that was, it was because of the Kanto region's isolation from much of Japan that that Ieyasu was one of the few daimyo who was able to largely stay out of Hideyoshi's very costly Imjin War, or the Japanese invasion of the Joseon dynasty of Korea, which lasted around 5 years, from 1592 to 1597, though some dates put it to 1598. And it was a very costly war, both in manpower and in money. And of course, Ieyasu was, as I said, was one of the few daimyo who was able to mainly be stationed in Hideyoshi's base, Nagoya Castle, during this war. And of course, as I mentioned in the Sengoku Jidai video and the Imjin War video, Hideyoshi would actually become one of the 5 most powerful daimyo in Japan, which eventually led him and the other 4 most powerful daimyo to be appointed to what is known as the Council of 5 Elders, a council that was established due to Hideyoshi's failing health. And eventually Hideyoshi would die, and it would actually be this Council of 5 Elders that would order the withdrawal of the rest of the Japanese forces from Joseon, Korea. And after the death of Hideyoshi, one of the members of the Council of 5, the individual you see over here on the right, Maeda Toshie, would actually be put in charge of the care of Hideyoshi's young heir, Toyotomi Hideyori. However, he also soon died. To put it in perspective, Hideyoshi died in 1598 CE, and Maeda Toshie would actually die in 1599 CE, only a year later. And this would leave a sort of power vacuum in the Council of 5 that would be filled by the individual you see on the right here, Ishida Mitsunari, who would also fill the role of caretaker of Toyotomi Hideyori. And this leads us to the unification of Japan by Tokugawa Ieyasu. So, during this time period, Ieyasu would see the death of Hideyoshi and see the death of Maeda Toshie, as well as the sort of position that Hideyori had taken as a puppet ruler by, the puppet of Ishida Mitsunari, would lead Ieyasu to decide it was time to make his move. So with that, Ieyasu would seize Hideyori's residence, Osaka Castle, and would begin a civil war with Ishida Mitsunari. And he would actually gather quite a large following of very powerful daimyo into his army, which would become known as the Eastern Army. Many of these daimyo included those you see here, one of the most prominent being the one on the right, Date Masamune, as well as entire clans like the Hoshikawa clan, as well as, in fact, I think the most interesting of which, he was able to gain the allegiance of 6 of the 7 spears of Shizugatake, who were essentially the 7 spears of Shizugatake were the sort of bodyguards and were, with the exception of Konishi Yukinaga, were the best generals that Toyotomi Hideyoshi had at his disposal. With the exception of Konishi Yukinaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu, these would be the best generals and most loyal generals that Hideyoshi had at his disposal. And here they are. Here, of course, the most famous of which was Kato Kiyomasa, the longtime rival of Konishi Yukinaga. And here are the rest of them. He, of course, also had the allegiance of his eldest son, Tokugawa Hidetada, as well as the eldest son of the head of the Sanada clan, Sanada Nobuyuki. But as you notice, there was that doesn't mean that all of the daimyo that sided with Ieyasu. Of course, just as many daimyo sided with Mitsunari's Western army. In fact, all 3 of the remaining members of the Council of 5 sided with Mitsunari. So that means that Tokugawa was facing 4 of the 5 members of the Council of 5, meaning that he was the only member of the Council of 5 that he had on his side. Remember, these were the 5 most powerful daimyo under the rule of Hideyoshi. And of course, you also had other very powerful daimyo, very skilled generals who fought alongside Kato Kiyomasa and others in the Imjin War, the Japanese invasions of Korea, the most notable of which were Onishi Yukinaga and Shimazu Yoshihiro, known as the Demon or the Oni Shimazu for his brutality in combat. You also had the remaining of the 7 spears of Shizugatake, as well as both Sanada Masayuki, the father of Sanada Nobuyuki, and Sanada Yukimura. So both Sanada Yukimura and Sanada Masayuki sided with Ishino Mitsunari, while the eldest son, Sanada Nobuyuki, sided with Ieyasu. And during this civil war, Ieyasu would actually win more battles than he lost. He would win several sieges, including the siege of Hisato and the siege of Fushimi Castle, among others. Though it is also important to note that his son, Hidetada, would fail to take Ueda Castle. And this is mainly because he was drawn into a siege by Sanada Nobuyuki and Sanada Yukimura. In fact, they would actually offer him, they would say that they were going to surrender, and then once Hidetada began to march into the castle, they began to ambush him. He was able to escape, so was Sanada Nobuyuki, who was with him at the time, but it was essentially a debacle and led to Hidetada being late for the most important battle of this conflict, the Battle of Sekigahara, which was where Tokugawa Ieyasu would achieve a final victory. And here's sort of the makeup of the battle. And as you can see, Ieyasu, during this battle, actually had much more forces than the Western army. And this was for a variety of reasons. I mean, to be fair, originally they were both relatively even. However, many of the daimyo, as you can see here, began to essentially decide to be bystanders, and then others defected from the Western side. In fact, they defected in the middle of the battle. The battle was essentially becoming a stalemate, and then as it began to look like to these various commanders that you see here that the Tokugawa forces, the Eastern Army, were beginning to win, they decided, well, let's pick the winning side, and they defected and charged into the ranks of their former allies and defeated them. Well, specifically, Ieyasu would defeat them, but that's how they saw it. And here's a painting of the battle in question. And with that, Ieyasu would be free to reunify Japan, though it was already unified by Hideyoshi, but it's called the unification of Japan, and establish his own shogunate. Now, it would be about 3 years after the Battle of Sekigahara before Ieyasu would officially become shogun, but become shogun he did. In 1603, Ieyasu would go to Kyoto, the then capital of Japan, and would be officially granted the title of shogun by Emperor Go-Yozei. I may have possibly butchered that. Apologies. And he would establish the Tokugawa Shogunate. And after doing that, he would make Edo Castle the de facto capital of Japan, as you can see here. And then he would go on to reward his allies and punish his enemies, unsurprisingly. So, now, let me preface this by there are more than these category of daimyos. There's actually a third category, but it's sort of irrelevant for what we're about to talk about. So, first off, the daimyo who would actually side with him for the most part, during the Civil War, would become what is known as Fudai daimyo, or hereditary vassals. They would have special privileges, and they would actually, for the most part, with a few exceptions, hold the largest provinces, the largest domains. And these included a variety of daimyo, including some of his key generals, such as Honda Tadakatsu or Naomasa. Meanwhile, the daimyo who sided with Ishida Mitsunari, again with a few exceptions, would become what is known as Tozama daimyo, or outside daimyo. Now, as I said, there were a few exceptions to this. For the most part, the Tozama daimyo would be daimyo who had sided with Ishida Mitsunari, such as Uesugi Kagekatsu or Mori Teramoto. However, some of Ieyasu's allies during the Civil War would also become Tozama daimyo, most notably Date Masamune. And that's because, it's a little bit of a mystery, but the running hypothesis by many historians is that it's because Date Masamune himself had a power base that was maybe not quite as large as Ieyasu's, but it was large enough to be considered a threat, especially considering Date Masamune could often be known to be particularly brutal and treacherous. However, he was also sort of the exception to the rule, because even though he was a Tozama daimyo, he still had one of the largest domains in Japan. He was still one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan, and he had special privileges that other Tozama daimyo did not have. But that aside, he was still a Tozama daimyo, even if he was we'll say he sort of teetered on the edge. He was a Tozama daimyo teetering on the edge of Fudai daimyo. And then, after punishing and rewarding his allies, Tokugawa Ieyasu would allow, air quotes, Toyotomi Hideori and his mother, Yodo-dono, to stay in Osaka Castle. Again, allow. It was essentially an exile. But considering the Neo-Confucian ideals and philosophy of Japan at the time, this was seen as sort of a benevolent way. This was the way you did things, especially to a member of a very powerful royal house. He would also go on to marry Hidetada's oldest daughter, Senehime, to Hideyori as a way of strengthening the ties with the Toyotomi house, and also as a way of sort of keeping an eye on Toyotomi Hideyori over the Toyotomi domain. And then he would also, during this time, establish what is known as the Sanken Kotai, or the compulsory attendance of daimyo to Edo. Now, to be fair, this was not formally codified until Tokugawa Ieyasu's grandson, but he created it specifically during this time period. And what this was it was the idea that all daimyo, both Tozama and Fudai, had to spend at least half of the year living in Edo. It was essentially a way, and a very ingenious way, of controlling all the daimyo. Because, of course, he was like, I don't want a repeat of the Genpei War and the Sengoku Jidai, and I also don't want a repeat of the Civil War that I started to get here. So I'm going to put this in place to make sure, as the saying goes, to keep my enemies close. So... and eventually, in 1605, after only being shogun for 3 years, 2 years, after only being shogun for 2 years, Ieyasu would step down as acting shogun and would take on the role of retired shogun, making his son, Hidetada, the official shogun, though he would also be the true ruler of Japan. And the reason he did this was actually a very ingenious thing. Is he did this as a way of sort of circumventing the events that led to the Civil War that he won, whereas he stepped down ahead of time and gave the throne, the title of shogun, to his son as a way of securing his legacy, as a way of securing the inheritance of the throne, that way making sure there was always a young, new shogun. There was always a viable heir sitting on the throne, something of which Hidetada would actually repeat. Though, for the rest of Ieyasu's life, despite not being the official shogun, Ieyasu would be the actual ruler of Japan. Which, and many of these decisions he made as retired shogun would include things like the reestablishment of trade, where Ieyasu would open up trade, very restricted trade, mind you, but reopen up trade with the rest of Asia, making sure that China and the Kingdom of Ryukyu only traded with the Satsuma domain, whereas Korea only traded with the Tsushima domain, and then the Ainu, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the video, only traded with the Matsumae domain. He would also go on to grant preferential trade to the Dutch East India Company in the 1610s CE. And also, one of the most interesting aspects of Ieyasu's rule, both his official rule and his unofficial rule, as his rule as the de facto ruler, even though his son Hidetada was the official shogun, was Ieyasu's use of the Englishman William Adams as a royal advisor. This is William Adams that you see here. And it was thanks to this advisement from William Adams that Ieyasu would eventually begin to distance himself and would also eventually ban Christianity in Japan entirely. So Christianity had some relationship with Japan for quite a while. They had made some inroads fairly early into the Sengoku Jidai, thanks to the Portuguese and the Spanish. and they had had some success in conversions, namely thanks to Jesuit Christians. However, there had also been incidents of distrust. In fact, distrust of Christians had been present in Japan since 1597, since what is known as the martyrdom of the 26 martyrs. So what this event was, and I touched upon it a little bit in the Sengoku Jidai video, but I didn't really go into detail because it was more pertinent for this video. So essentially what happened is a Spanish ship of that carried several Jesuit priests crash landed in the Chosokape domain. And initially the Chosokape were willing to help these Spanish sailors and Jesuits, but they were also a little bit distrustful. They began to wonder, like, well, why did they crash here? Like, they're, why did they suddenly show up here? Are they spies? And when they began to refuse to give certain concessions to the martyrs, the captain of the ship said that the Spanish Empire would invade and punish Japan for their mistreatment. So this led the Chosokabe domain, as well as Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself, to view Christians as spies, to view Spanish Christians specifically as spies. And so in response to this, they gathered up the Jesuit priests and executed them, which eventually led to them being known as the 26 Martyrs of Japan. However, despite this, Tokugawa Ieyasu for a time was actually willing to allow some inroads, some Christian missions into Japan. In fact, as this picture shows, he even sent some emissaries to Rome, which you see here. So there were Jesuit missions to Japan, and there were Japanese missions to Rome. And he also began to open up trade negotiations with Spanish Manila in the Philippines, as well as the fact that one of his own daimyo, Date Masamune, became a patron of Christianity. However, this began to change when several Christian missionaries and several Christian daimyo began to bribe other daimyo for land titles. And eventually this bribery and this conspiracy was found out and put a stop to. But the fact that these Christian missionaries and these Christian daimyo were able to bribe other daimyo to gain land titles so easily alarmed Tokugawa Ieyasu, so he officially banned Christianity from Japan entirely, which led daimyo who'd originally been favorable to Christianity, such as Date Masamune, to essentially be like, "Oh, sorry, we changed our mind," and then push and exile Christians from their domain. That being said, Date Masamune would still send emissaries on ships, such as an emissary that he sent on San Juan Bautista to Rome. The emissary being Hasakura Tsunaga. Apologies if I butchered that. And you can see when he sent the expedition, and it left actually the year after Tokugawa Ieyasu would officially ban Christianity from Japan. And then it was also during these early Tokugawa Shogunate years that we would see the first examples of Tokugawa military expansion outside of Japan itself, starting with the Satsuma invasion of the Kingdom of Ryukyu in 1609 CE. So the Kingdom of Ryukyu was an island kingdom to the south of Japan that had been relatively independent from Japan for centuries. They had been their own independent entity, and they had been sort of the main middlemen of trade between Japan and China, with the other middleman being Joseon Korea. And for the longest time, there was sort of this disconnect of between the Kingdom of Ryukyu and the southernmost domain of Japan, the Satsuma domain, which was ruled by the Shimazu clan. The Shimazu clan believed that they were the rulers, they were the true masters of the Kingdom of Ryukyu. Sorry, they were the true masters of the Kingdom of Ryukyu. And the idea was that the Kingdom of Ryukyu was their vassal state, was their tributary state, and of course the Kingdom of Ryukyu was like, no, we're not. We're a vassal state, of official tributary state of China, not you. Just whatever, leave us alone. And of course, for the longest time, the Shimazu clan did nothing. They made no attempts to actually rectify or to back up their claims. But all of this would change in 1609, and it started with Ryukyu sailors crash landing on the Japanese coast, who would actually be officially returned to the Kingdom of Ryukyu by Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Tokugawa Shogunate. And after this, the current daimyo of the Shimazu clan, Shimazu Tadatsune, would demand, quote-unquote, the Kingdom of Ryukyu to thank Ieyasu and the Tokugawa Shogunate for the return of the Ryukyu sailors. Now, from what the documents show, and from what I've been able to garner, the Ryukyu Kingdom actually obliged and actually did send official thanks to the Tokugawa Shogunate. However, of course, the Shimazu domain did not actually pass those letters on. They were sent to the Shimazu domain first, and the Shimazu domain was like, no, we never received it. And then upon never receiving it, they asked Ieyasu permission to invade Ryukyu in retaliation for never apologizing, with a 3,000-man army, which Ieyasu gave permission. Now, of course, this was a thinly veiled ploy. It was actually, rather than being a punishment for not thanking the Tokugawa Shogunate, it was, of course, really just an attempt or a plan to finally back up their claims and finally make Ryukyu their tributary vassal. And so in 1609 they left Satsuma and quickly secured. They bypassed the Takara Islands, quickly secured the Amami Island and captured it, and they began to move to Takuna Island, where they would win a variety of victories. They would secure Okino Erebu Island, apologies for butchering that, and eventually would bypass Yoron Island to head for the capital, where they would anchor on Koru Island, and they would march. They would land at Unten, and they would secure Nakajin Castle, and they would move to attack the capital. They would also capture several other Ryukyu castles, such as Oroso and Shuri. Apologies for possibly butchering that. And they would eventually, during this invasion, actually capture the Ryukyu king, Shone, and they would take him back to Satsuma for 2 years and eventually force him to make Ryukyu a tributary of Satsuma, though Ryukyu would still remain relatively independent after this, because, of course, tributary did not mean actual domain. They had been tributaries of China for centuries before then, and they still remain tributaries of China also. They would just also be a tributary of the Satsuma domain. And while the Shimazu clan was expanding its power into the Kingdom of Ryukyu, was expanding its Satsuma domain, or the influence of its Satsuma domain into the Kingdom of Ryukyu, Tokugawa Ieyasu was also strengthening and increasing the power that he and the Tokugawa Shogunate had over the Japanese government overall. And he did this by creating a variety of different laws in order to control various aspects of Japanese bureaucracy. The first of which were the laws for the imperial and court officials, which were relatively straightforward. The idea was like the emperor should dedicate to scholarship and poetry only, and it of course was like there are various restrictions and provisions on how a member of the aristocracy can be promoted, what kind of costume they could wear, and what kind of ranks they could have. The much more extensive laws were the laws for military houses, which were created around the same time as a way to make sure that no single daimyo could gain enough power to become a serious threat. They included a variety of different measures designed to control and limit the power of daimyo, and samurai also. Such as the samurai class should only devote itself to pursuits appropriate to the warrior aristocracy, like archery, swordsmanship. Daimyo cannot engage with interactions of with people of other domains, samurai or commoners. Castles can be repaired, but they can only be repaired with the permission of the shogun. And daimyo must present themselves at Edo for service to the shogunate. Go back to the Sanken Kotai that I talked about earlier. I.e., this is a way of making sure that there, or at least a very well-designed attempt to make sure that conflict, that threats to his power would not arise again. However, despite this, a threat to his power would indeed soon arise, and would lead to an event known as, by a couple of different names. First, the Siege of Osaka, also the Osaka Campaign. So the Osaka Campaign would be the sort of culmination of a variety of different events that Tokugawa Ieyasu would perceive as a threat. First, Toyotomi Hideyori would rebuild and fortify Osaka Castle in 1614 CE. He would also rebuild the Hokoji Temple in the same year. Specifically, he would create this bell that you see here, which would have a variety of inscriptions on it, but the one that angered Ieyasu the most was this inscription, which he sort of saw, which stated, "May noble lord and servants be rich and cheerful," which Ieyasu interpreted as like cursing him and shattering his name, and etc., etc. Now, more than likely, he probably didn't actually believe that. More than likely, he had been looking for a reason for a while to get rid of Hideyori, and this is just the best excuse he can come up with. Sort of. There's also a little bit more to the story, because Hideyori, and specifically his mother, Yorodono, would invite large amounts of ronin, or masterless samurai, to Osaka Castle. Specifically, ronin, samurai who had served on the Western Army, in the Western Army side, on the side of the Toyotomi army, and on the side of Ishiro Mitsunari. So, of course, these were a lot of men who didn't like the Tokugawa Shogunate already. And so all of these threats combined would eventually lead to the event known as the Osaka Campaign, or the Siege of Osaka. But before we get into that, let's take a look at sort of the leadership of both armies. So, as I said, on the Toyotomi side, the army, all the ronin and the military forces that Yorodono specifically, but also Hideyori, began to gather at Osaka Castle, included a lot of former Toyotomi and former commanders of Ishiro Mitsunari's army. The most notable of which were individuals like Sanada Yukimura and Chosakawa Morochika, and also Goto Motosugu. But also individuals like Ban Naoyuki and Kimura Shigenari. Meanwhile, the Tokugawa army would mainly be led by Tokugawa Ieyasu and his son Hidetada. Though it's pretty well known that Tokugawa Ieyasu didn't really trust his son Hidetada because he still blamed him and was still relatively angry about Hidetada losing the siege of Ueda and being late to the Battle of Sekigahara. But also, he had other skilled commanders leading the army or leading contingents of the army as well, of the Tokugawa army as well. The most notable of which was one of his most powerful daimyo, Dake Masamune, but also individuals who had actually sided with the Toyotomi during the Civil War, but had also not, surprisingly, not gone to Osaka. And those individuals included people like Uesugi Kagekatsu, who, as you remember, sided on fought on the Toyotomi side, on the Ishida Mitsunari side during the Civil War. And then other individuals included, again, brother against brother, Sanada Nobuyuki fighting his younger brother, Sanada Yukimura, and then, of course, other generals like Takatora. So the Osaka campaign is actually divided into two different things, into two different campaigns, the winter campaign and the spring campaign. With the winter campaign actually being the longer of the two events. So the winter campaign began with a variety of different small-scale skirmishes, some of which were inconclusive, but some of which, most of which, led to Tokugawa victories, such as the Tokugawa victory at the Battle of Imafuku in 1614 CE. And these victories on the Tokugawa side, and then, the at best inconclusive battles in the case of the Toyotomi side, led to the Toyotomi forces holding up and fortifying themselves inside of Osaka Castle. And it also led to these military commanders, such as Sanada Yukimura, to building onto the already impressive fortifications of Osaka Castle and creating additional forts such as the Sanadamaru, which was attached to Osaka Castle in 1615 CE. And eventually, this would lead to the full-scale bombardment and siege of Osaka. So after forcing the Toyotomi forces to hole up in Osaka Castle, Tokugawa Ieyasu and Tokugawa Hidetada would surround Osaka and would, rather than, say, committing forces to full-scale assaults on Osaka Castle, they would actually turn around and bring in new weapons, cannons that they had bought from the Dutch and the British. Now, cannons had been in Japan for a while, but these were more advanced cannons that they had bought off of the now more advanced British and Dutch. For centuries, it was actually Japan, Korea, and China that were more advanced than Europe, but now Europe had caught up. And so with these new, more powerful cannons, Ieyasu and Hidetada were able to keep their forces safely back while they were able to bombard and just decimate the fortifications of Osaka. And eventually this bombardment led to Yorodono and Hideyori sending several emissaries such as Ono Harunaga, Oda Nobukatsu, and Okurakyo no Subono to attempt to negotiate peace with Ieyasu. However, these negotiations would collapse when Ieyasu found out that, guess what? Hideyori and Sanada Yukimura and all the commanders at Osaka were rebuilding the damaged fortifications from the siege. And so this led to the summer campaign. I'd said spring campaign a few minutes ago. I meant summer campaign. The summer campaign, which was much shorter, lasting from only May to June 1615 CE. And this campaign again resulted in several very key Tokugawa victories at the battles of Kashi over here on the left, Domoyoji in the center, and Yao on the right, resulting in the deaths of several key commanders of the Toyotomi side, including, I believe, Chosukabe Morishika. And eventually, these victories would lead to a final confrontation at the Battle of Tennoji in June 1615 CE. And this battle would at first actually look like the Toyotomi side was gaining the upper hand. And it's because, mainly because of the skilled tactical mind of Sanada Yukimura. However, he would eventually receive a fatal gunshot wound, because, again, both sides had gunpowder weapons, a fatal gunshot wound to the chest, and after he died, the army, having already lost several of its other key commanders, now losing its primary commander and its most skilled tactical commander, began to lose military cohesion and would eventually scatter to the winds, of course, resulting in quite a lot of deaths on the Toyotomi side. However, despite achieving this final victory over his longtime enemies of the Toyotomi and Sanada clans, Ieyasu would die only a year later in 1616 CE. It's not clear what he died of, but it's the most likely culprits seem to be either cancer or syphilis. But of course, Ieyasu had already abdicated the throne for his son Hidetada, who would officially rule as shogun from 1605 to 1623 CE, though he would actually rule from 1616 to 1632 CE, his period of unofficial rule. And it's because in 1623 he would follow in his father's footsteps and would abdicate the throne for his son, and would become himself a retired shogun, though he, of course, would be the actual power behind the Japanese throne. And he would also go on to continue many of his father's policies. He would marry one of his other daughters, Masako, off to the Japanese emperor in order to strengthen ties between the Japanese royal court and the Tokugawa Shogunate. And he would expand his father's anti-Christian laws, actually making even more draconian anti-Christian laws than his father did, implementing laws that his father had only considered but never actually implemented. These laws included decreeing that Christians or suspected Christians had to stomp on an image of Jesus, the idea being, of course, Christians would not defile the image of Christ, and if they refused to do so, they would be put to death. And they would also go on to force Christian daimyos to commit seppuku if they refused to renounce their Christianity. Now, seppuku is a ritual suicide that is designed for samurai to maintain their honor. It was i.e. you were to kill yourself, and if you killed yourself, you would still be honorable. But of course, it was also in practice a good way to get rid of your people you considered a threat. He would also ban all Christian books, whether they were of Japanese origin or European origin, and eventually all of these policies would result in the execution of 55 Christians, both foreign and Japanese, in Nagasaki in 1628 CE. And eventually, he too would die in 1632 CE, and the shogunate would be inherited by his son, Tokugawa Iemitsu. Now, as I said earlier, Iemitsu had been the official shogun since 1623 CE, but the real power behind the throne was actually Hidetada, much like Ieyasu was the real power behind the throne, despite Hidetada being the official shogun. In the early years of Ieyamitsu's rule would involve, in later years of Hidetada's rule, would involve a variety of different controversies. One of the most prominent of which being the Purple Robe incident, in which the Emperor of China, of Japan at the time, Emperor Mizuno, would award 2 different Buddhist temples the right to wear purple robes, something that in previous years and previous centuries had only been reserved to the most devout of Buddhist monasteries. But he allowed 2 monasteries to have that right, something which angered Hidetada and Ieyamitsu, and they forced Emperor Go Mizuno to take back the decree, and they would force Mizuno to abdicate the throne, and they would put Empress Meisho on the throne. And then it was also during the Ieyamitsu, the reign of Ieyamitsu, that the Sakoku Edict would be officially decreed, which officially cut off Japan from, for the most part, from the rest of the world. The Japanese were to be kept within their own boundaries. Anyone who left the country or was caught trying to leave the country would be executed. Anyone who left the country and returned from abroad was to be executed. Catholicism was strictly forbidden, and Christians were persecuted even more than they already were during the reign of Hidetada and Ieyasu. And trade with outside powers was heavily restricted, with the Chinese, Dutch, and Portuguese being restricted to enclaves in Nagasaki, and trade with China being mainly conducted through semi-independent vassal kingdom of the Ryukyus, and trade with Korea via the Tsushima domain, and then the trade with the Ainu people, who again we'll talk about later on in the video, mainly through the Matsumae domain. And the effects of these edicts can be best seen in the Shimabara and Amakusa domains, which were the domains that were ruled by the Matsukura family, specifically Matsukura Shigemasa. And here is the Amakusa Islands. There's the Shimabara Peninsula. So Matsukura Shigemasa was particularly well known for his brutality and his brutal purges against Christians. He was known for slaughtering entire families if they were suspected of being Christian, and he was known for his particularly brutal methods, which included things like, of course, decapitation, torture, burning alive, etc., etc. He was also well known for his heavy taxation of his own domain, the Shimabara and Amakusa domains, because he planned to invade the Spanish East Indies, because he sort of fancied himself as sort of a successor to the Shimazu and Satsuma domain, and he wanted to sort of gain his own tributary states as well. He also sort of saw himself as a successor to Tokugawa Ieyasu and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. But eventually, he would die at the Obama Hot Springs in 1630 CE. And it's not really clear what happened. He may have had failing health at the time, but it's also equally likely because of all the enemies he made due to his purges and his heavy taxation, his overtaxation, in fact, of his domains, that he may have also been assassinated. But we'll never know for sure. But regardless of the cause of his death, he did die, and he would be succeeded by his son, Matsukura Katsui, in 1630 CE. It was also during this time that, in conjunction with the purges against Christians and the overtaxation of the Shimabara and Amakusa domains, that the Shimabara and Amakusa domains would also become hotbeds of for Ronin, masterless samurai, to gather. Of course, particularly enemies of the state, people who had fought against the Tokugawa Shogunate during the Sekigahara, during the Civil War that ended with Sekigahara, and during the Osaka campaign. Also, at the same time this was happening, a young boy named Shiro Amakusa, also known as Jerome Amakusa, he took a European name, would begin to sort of see himself, maybe, it may have been Christian propaganda, but he began to see himself as chosen by God, and he would begin to proselytize Christianity heavily throughout the Amakusa domain specifically, but also through the Shimabara domain. And we'd sort of become a folk hero in the region. All of these events together would eventually lead to the event known as the Shimabara Invasion or the Shimabara Rebellion, which lasted from 1637 to 1638 CE. Now, there's an official and unofficial cause of the rebellion. The unofficial cause and the actual cause of this rebellion was that all of the Ronin, these enemies of the state who had been gathering in the Shimabara and Amakusa regions, began to stir up discontent among these. Well, I don't want to say stir up, the discontent was already there, but they began to really accentuate the discontent, would begin to sort of be like, hey, why are we complaining and why aren't we rebelling? And so they would incite rebellion and lead the rebellion. They would become the leaders of the rebellion in 1637 CE. Now, the official start of the rebellion was supposedly the rebellion was started by Shiro Amakusa, who was the folk hero of the region. But in actuality, a gang of 5 different very influential Ronin in the region, led by Mori Sokuin, would actually appoint Shiro Amakusa as the figurehead of the rebellion. So they held the real power, and actually it was a little more than 5, but the gang of 5 is the official title of them. But Shiro Amakusa would be the front man. He would be the one that everyone said was the leader. And initially, with the start of this rebellion, for one thing, Matsura Katsui was actually not present. He was actually in Edo at the time, but his magistrate would actually send an army against the rebels. However, the army was relatively untrained. Many of the soldiers were young, had not participated in any of the campaigns, whether it be the Sengoku Jidai, or the invasion of Korea, or the Sekigahara campaign, or the Osaka campaign. None of them had participated in that, and they were all just relatively green. Meanwhile, the Ronin, the rebels, were filled with Ronin who were veterans of all of these campaigns and were therefore very experienced. And so they caught the magistrate forces, the forces of the Matsukura domain, in an ambush and inflicted heavy casualties on them. They did this, one, because they were better hand-to-hand fighters, but also because they had rifles, not rifles, they had muskets at their disposal, which were relatively endemic throughout Japan, but the Matsukura domain did not have very many, and they had some outdated versions, whereas these Ronin had kept many of their more up-to-date versions after their, for example, the Osaka campaign. So they were much better armed. But it should also be noted that while they did attempt to take various castles in these domains, such as Shimabara Castle, Tomioka Castle, and Hondo Castle. I should note that this is not actually Hondo Castle. This is just a picture of a castle I found because I could not find an example of Hondo Castle. But anyways, while they did attempt to take these castles in sieges, they failed. These sieges were very inconclusive, and they were easily repelled by forces that were just as veteran as they were that were present in these castles. So, in response to this, the rebels would go to a neglected neglected castle called Terra Castle, and would make it their base. And of course, they would take the time, much like Ieyasu had done with Edo, and much like Hideyori had done with Osaka. They would take the time to rebuild and heavily fortify this castle. So, in response to this rebellion, in response to the attack by these rebels, Tokugawa Ieyasu would order a counterattack against the rebels. And he would put in charge a variety of different daimyo, but some of the main examples, some of the main leaders of this expeditionary force would be Itakura Shigemasa, as well as Hoshikawa Tadatoshi, as well as Hoshikawa Tadatoshi's strategic advisor and sword instructor, Miyamoto Musashi, over on the right. Who, again, was not a main commander, he was an advisor. But it's also important to note he was also a veteran of the Sekigahara and Osaka campaigns, and had actually fought against the Tokugawa side during those campaigns, though he was a young Ronin at the time and was a cog in the machine, was not one of the leaders. And they would lead an army numbering around 200,000. Maybe, of course, this could be exaggerated, but the estimate is around 200,000 against the rebels. And eventually they would get to Hara Castle, and they would set up cannon batteries and would lay siege to Hara Castle. And in the process, Itakura would hear that one of his rivals, who we'll talk about in a second, was on their way to replace him. And so, not wanting his glory to be taken from him, he would attempt an assault on Hara Castle and would die in the assault, and the assault would be repelled. And this rival who was on the way to replace him was an individual known as Matsudaira Nobutsuna, who was on his way to replace Itakura because he sort of viewed Itakura. He didn't think Itakura was doing enough to get the job done. And of course, he brought reinforcements with him. He brought a lot of Ashigaru, who had been trained in musketry and gunpowder weapons, and he brought a lot of cavalry, heavy cavalry, and heavy infantry. He would also request aid from the Dutch at Dijima, asking them to bombard Hara Castle, because he knew that at the time the Dutch had better cannons than Japan did. And here's some of the Dutch naval ships that they sent there. However, these bombardments were relatively inconclusive. However, Matsudaira did not see it that way. He just saw it sort of like as the first step, because while they were inconclusive and they didn't end the siege, they did cause quite a lot of devastation in the castle itself, and so it meant that it meant that the individuals in the people holding out in the castle were in much worse shape. They were being whittled away, and their resources were being whittled away inch by inch. And in fact, it was because of these bombardments, won by the first commanders, and then by Matsudaira, and then by the Dutch, that wreaked havoc on the rebel supplies, that eventually led the rebels to attempt a raid on the Tokugawa camp, only to be repelled by the Tokugawa forces, and resulting in heavy casualties. Eventually, several Tokugawa commanders would take it upon themselves to sort of seize the initiative. One of the best examples would be Karuta Tadayuki, who would lead a successful assault on and would successfully capture the outer defenses of Hara Castle. Now, he was not able to go further than this, but this was definitely the sort of beginning of the end for the besiegers in Hara Castle. Eventually, though, the final nail in the coffin, while the besieging of the Dutch, then the destruction of their supplies, and the casualties they suffered in the failed raid, and Karuta Tadayuki's successful capture of the outer fences, while all of those were definitely nails in the coffin of the Hara, of the defenders in the Hara Castle, of the rebels, the absolute final nail in the coffin for these rebels was the fact that one of the Gang of Five, Yamada Imosaku, now this is not a Yamada, this is a Ronin, but this is sort of what he may have looked like. Yamada Imosaku, of the Gang of Five, of the 5 main leaders of the rebellion, would sort of decide that he didn't like being on the losing side, so he would switch sides, send letters to the leadership of the Tokugawa army saying, "Hey, I don't like this anymore. I'm switching to your side. I surrender. I was only pretending to be Christian." And then he would open the gates of Hara Castle, allowing the Tokugawa forces to rush in and slaughter the Shimabara rebels. As you can see here, this is the final assault on Hara Castle and the destruction of the rebel forces. So now that we have talked about the Shimabara Rebellion as well as the brutal victory, the brutal slaughter of the Shimabara rebels at the hands of the Tokugawa forces, now it's time to talk about the aftermath. So first off, the policy of national seclusion was made even stricter in 1639, with relations with the Portuguese being completely cut off. As in, the Portuguese were no longer allowed to trade in Japan at all. This was, of course, decreed by Tokugawa Iemitsu himself, and this made sure that the only European power allowed to trade with Japan at all was the Dutch. And then Tokugawa Iemitsu would then order Matsukura Katsui to commit seppuku, and then he would give Matsukura Katsui's domain to another daimyo. Also, it was because of this rebellion, because of the slaughter and the persecutions, that the Christians in Japan would go into hiding and would only worship in secret, which we'll talk a little bit about a little bit more later. And then Tokugawa Iemitsu would heavily promote Buddhism in the Shimabara and Amakusa regions. All right, so now that we have talked about the reigns of the first 3 Tokugawa shoguns and the warfare and struggles that they faced and decisions that they made in sort of the early years of Tokugawa Japan, now we can move on to the what is known as the Pax Tokugawa, or the Edo period, the time, the 250-ish, give or take, year, depending on how you look at which year you look at, time period of peace and prosperity in Japan. Now, officially, the Pax Tokugawa, as I talked about at the beginning of the video with the title, started in 1603 and continued until 1853 CE. But I would argue that it really started in 1638 with the final major military conflict being the Shimabara Rebellion. Because before 1638, while the Tokugawa Shogunate had unified Japan, there were still large-scale wars. There was the Sekigahara campaign, there was the invasion of Ryukyu, there was the Osaka campaign, and there was the Shimabara Rebellion. It was only after that period that Japan faced, for the most part, total peace. So first, we're going to look at the Edo period government. So overall, the Japanese government, the Edo period government, was built mainly off of the Neo-Confucian philosophy, which itself, of course, was based originally on Confucianism. However, they differed because while Confucianism was created in 600 BCE, Neo-Confucianism was created in the Tang and Song dynasties, and it had a lot more religious beliefs. It mixed religious beliefs with political philosophy. It had a stricter reverence of the past, and it had a much stricter idea of social hierarchy, as well as believed in the balance between man and nature, as well as systems for good and evil, and also mixed actually Buddhism and Taoism with the pre-existing Confucian ideals. So the Tokugawa government was divided up into various different systems. So on paper, the royal court, the emperor, was on top. In reality, the Bakufu, or the Tokugawa Shogunate, was the main power, and they were divided. And below them were three different sets of daimyo. So this is where the third category of daimyo that I alluded to back at a little bit earlier in the video comes in, which are the Shimpan daimyo, who were essentially the three households that were related to the Tokugawa clan. They didn't have the Tokugawa name, but they were related to Tokugawa via blood and marriage and things like that. And the reason I didn't mention them is, again, they were related to the Tokugawa clan and were always allies to begin with, and so they were not relevant to the daimyo that Ieyasu punished and rewarded. And then under the Shimpan, you had the Fudai daimyo, who were the vassals of Ieyasu, who were his sworn allies during the war, during the civil war that ended in Sekigahara. And then you had the Tozama daimyo, who were outsider daimyo and had a somewhat independent existence, but were also a lower rank than the Fudai and Shimpan daimyo. And then below all of these were castle towns, and of course below the castle towns were villages. And this is a little bit another look at sort of the organization of the Tokugawa Shogunate. Where the shogun was the actual ruler, the daimyo were the large landowners, and then below the daimyo were samurai warriors who were the sort of retainers of the daimyo and the shogun, and then below them were the peasants, who still had a relatively high status, and they were about 80% of the population, 4/5 of the population. And then you had artisans next, who were the people who were not as high as peasants, but were higher status than merchants, and they were craftspeople such as artists and blacksmiths, though they could become relatively wealthy. And then merchants, who were the lowest status, but they also began over time to become relatively wealthy and also began to gain influence. They were considered the lowest status because they were not artisans, they didn't make anything, and they were not peasants, they did not provide the food base for the Tokugawa Shogunate, for Japan as a whole. They just sold stuff, which is very similar to the Chinese idea of the social classes, where merchants were also the lowest class. And then you had the institutions of the shogunate, sort of the different ranks you could have. You had the senior elders, who were in charge of things that included but were not limited to relations with the emperor, supervision of the daimyo, managing official documents, supervision of internal affairs, etc. Then you had the junior elders, who were in charge of supervising the direct vassals of the shogun, namely the Hatamoto and the Gokuin, using reports provided by Metsuki. They also oversaw activities of artisans and physicians, and even in the event of war, theoretically, were the ones who led the Hatamoto into battle. And then you had the Sanbugyo, or the three administrators, which included individuals such as the Geisha Bugyo, who were the highest status, who oversaw Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. Then you had the Kanjo Bugyo, who were holders of office to the Rujo. They were responsible for the finances of the shogunate. And then you had the lowest, the Machi Bugyo, who were the sort of magistrates and chief administrators of cities. Then below the Bugyo, the Sanbugyo, were the Ometsuki and the Metsuki, who were the inspectors, sort of the secret police, who were in charge of meeting out corruption and anyone who might be planning to conspire against the Bakufu, against the shogunate. And they had two different jobs. So the Ometsuki let me rephrase that. They had similar jobs, but also different jobs. The Ometsuki and the Metsuki did the same job. The only difference is the Ometsuki monitored the daimyos as well as members of the imperial court, whereas the Metsuki were responsible for the Haramoto and the Gokuin and the lower class samurai, with the Ometsuki reporting to the senior elders and the Metsuki reporting to the junior elders. Then below the Ometsuki and Metsuki, you had the Tenryo, Gundai, and Daikon system. So the Tenryo were the shogun's estates, and so the Gundai managed the Tokugawa domains with incomes greater than 10,000 koku, while the Daikon oversaw and managed domains that were below 10,000. They were between 5,000 and 10,000. And then the two lowest ranks you had were the Hatamoto, who were the upper vassals of the Tokugawa house, who had the right to an audience with the shogun, whereas the Gokuin did not have that right. Other than that, they were relatively the same rank. Now we're going to take a look at the Edo period society. So, of course, at the top of the society was the shogun, who was the de facto ruler of Japan. He was the one in charge of all military affairs and foreign relations, and really the one in charge of everything, even though the emperor was the one in theory in charge. And they were seated, the Tokugawa shoguns were seated in Edo, that you see here, which became a prosperous city at the time. And they oversaw directly the daimyo. And the daimyo were these regional lords, were these governors, if you will, who oversaw the samurai and the peasants in their domains. And of course, there were, like as I said, there were daimyo classifications. You had the Shimpan, the relatives, who were the 3 families or 6 clans who were established by sons of Ieyasu. They were always allies, and they would provide essentially. So let's put it this way. So say Hidetada died and then Ieyasu died without heirs, then these families would be the ones who would provide the backup heirs to the shogunate. And then of course you had the other ones that we already talked about, the Fudai and the Tozuma daimyo. And here's sort of a map of the various daimyos and domains that fit within those categories. And daimyo lands were based not off of, like, say, gold, what the, like, money revenue, like gold or silver or paper money. They were based off of the amount of taxable lands that were in there, i.e. the productivity of the land, because the main thing that was taxed by the shogunate were crops like rice and eventually cash crops like cotton and other things like that. And then, of course, the next class below them, the people who served the daimyo and, of course, the shogun, were the samurai, who were only about 10% of the population. Samurai means one who serves. They were 10%, 1/15 of the population, and they were themselves divided by a hierarchy of ranks, and were. Now, so this says bound by a code of ethics known as Bushido. Bushido, while it was an informal form of ethics, before the Tokugawa Shogunate, it did not really become a codified form of ethics until the Shogunate, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You know, they were the ones who were allowed to have swords and things like that, and they were allowed certain privileges such as the Kirisuts Gomen, which is the right to cut down offending commoners without rebuke, etc., etc. And they were, for centuries, from around 1417 CE until now, the 1600s CE, the warrior class. They had held high status, and they were the one, and this was because of the large-scale wars that persisted for centuries. But now, in a time of peace, they had to turn their attentions to other things, such as being teachers in schools of swordsmanship, teachers in general, poets and scholars. Some became Buddhist monks, and of course, as we talked about a few minutes ago, many of them went into government posts or civil administration. Yeah. Now, as I said just a couple of seconds ago, Bushido before the Edo period had not really been codified. It was a informal code of ethics for samurai, but there was no book. There was no handbook talking about how the codes samurai should follow. That whole idea of honor and we can never use sneak attacks or anything like that. That didn't exist before the Edo period at all. And even, as we'll talk about in a minute, even did continue to exist in the Edo period. But generally, during the Edo period, the samurai no longer having wars that they could focus their attentions on, now had to focus on new avenues of work, new activities. And so this is when they began to create things like the Code of Bushido that you see here. The next below them were the peasants, who again were around 80% of the population. They were not allowed. So unlike China and Korea, where you could take a civil service examination and could, in theory, ascend the ranks of social society. So you could go from being a peasant to a member of the aristocracy. In Edo Japan, that was not the case. Peasants were expected to conform to the ethos of frugality. They were taxed around 40 to 50% of their crops. They were forbidden all access to recreation and games other than local festivals. They were required to provide labor for public works, on demand, constructions, bridges, etc. And they were governed by the village unit led by the village headman. Then below them were artists, who were highly skilled artists, produced high quality paper, clocks, pans, and porcelains and containers. And then, of course, there were others who were just simply potters and things like that. And then the lowest were the townspeople and merchants, who were strictly governed by sumptuary laws dictating what they could wear and where they could live and the size of home. In fact, there were entire sections of cities, like entire sections of Edo, for example, which were where merchants were segregated to, etc., etc. But because of that, major commercial centers began to emerge. For example, Osaka was a place where you could get sake, soy sauce, cloth, paper, iron, etc. And they would often trade along what is known as the Tokaido Road, which we'll talk about in a minute. And merchants, of course, were the ones who bought from artisans to trade and sell, and they were at the bottom because they didn't produce anything, produce any of what they sold, and of course, and they also acted as bankers. But as I said earlier in the video, merchants eventually did begin to become very wealthy and began to become very influential, such as the Mitsui family and the Sumitomo family that you see here. But of course, while we've looked at all the different social classes, we would be very remiss not to look at the role of women. Now, of course, the role of women varied immensely according to social status, but generally they were expected to submit to the male heads of their household, much like women in China, Imperial China at the time. but they could also become a ranking member of the household if their husband died, again, much like Imperial China. Women from lower classes were much less restricted by social expectations. Marriage was not based on romantic attraction. Families actually used marriage as a way to increase social standing among wealthier families. Female virginity was unsurprisingly very important. And divorce actually was common. It was women from poor households could actually leave their husbands very easily. Also, there was a sort of a hypocrisy, sort of a double standard in terms of how many sexual partners you could have. Men could have, especially men of upper classes, could have multiple concubines and such, but women could not. Women also were a major factor, were a major component of prostitution. And unlike in China, where many women actually went into it willingly, most of the women in Japan did not choose this occupation. Many of these women were born into impoverished families and farming or fishing villages and were sold into this profession around the age of 7 or 8 by desperate families. And the tradition was rationalized by Confucian ideals that allowed children to work out of duty to their parents, who usually had 10-year contracts, though, of course, sometimes these contracts could go for longer. Little girls would do daily chores, and then eventually by 11 or 12, they would be go into the actual profession or begin training for the actual profession. And if you were, sometimes you would be chosen for elite courtesan training, which would include things like being trained how to play the flute or stringed instruments, how to perform the tea ceremony, how to play games like backgammon. And women, again, much like Imperial China, would be expected to be well-read and literate in order to engage in stimulating conversation. But this was not encouraged to pursue for their own fulfillment. It was encouraged to make them much more appealing to men. In fact, by this practice became so prominent that by 1800 CE, there were various different densely populated areas, such as Yoshiwara, that was home to around 4,000 of these prostitutes. And here's a picture of a lot of that here. Okay, so now we're going to move away from the social classes, and we're going to take a little bit a closer look at the different avenues, the different activities that samurai took and focused on in this age of peace. The most important of which is the development of swords and martial arts academies. Now, it should be clear that these kenjutsu dojos, these sword schools, existed before the Edo period, but by the height of the Edo period, the 1700s and early 1800s, there were over 500 kenjutsu schools throughout Japan alone. And the development of these kenjutsu schools is, and thanks mainly because of famous swordsmen and samurai of the early Edo period. The most famous of which is an individual that we mentioned a little bit earlier, Miyamoto Musashi, who lived from 1584 to 1645 CE. And he had a very interesting and very battle-filled life. He participated in his teens at the Battle of Sekigahara, as well as in the Osaka campaign on the side of the Toyotomi side, Toyotomi Hideyori and Ishida Mitsunari and Sanada Yukimura, as well as participated in an advisory role in the Shimabara Rebellion on the Tokugawa side. He was renowned through stories of his unique double-bladed swordsmanship, and he holds a record of being undefeated in 61 duels. He's also the founder of the Nitten Ichi-ryu, or the Nito Ichi-ryu style of swordsmanship. And in his final years, he authored the Book of Five Rings and Dokodo, or the path of aloneness. So Nitin Ichiryu is mainly known for its two-sword style, i.e., say, using a katana and a wakizashi, which is the short sword, or say the nodachi or kodachi and tachi, which is even shorter than the wakizashi, etc. But not just that. They also taught things like, for example, the Jute Jutsu or Truncheon art, which I'll show what that is in a second, as well as Bojutsu or staff art. He was very clear, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Musashi Miyamoto Musashi was very clear on not doing over specialization. He was like, all weapons are important. We need to know how to use all of them. So here is a Jute, which is sort of like a baton that police forces would use in Japan, the inspectors would use in Japan, and it was very good for catching and breaking swords. Here is the nodachi or kodachi, so the nodachi or odachi, sorry. Here's the kodachi and wakizashi. There's the katana, and then there's the bow staff that was used in Bojutsu. And his most famous work is of philosophy and sword strategy is the Book of Five Rings, which is where he put down most of his philosophy as a swordsman, such as this quote right here, which says, "Whatever attitude you are in, do not be conscious of making the attitude. Think only of cunning." In other words, don't overthink things. Just be in the moment and battle. And then, of course, he also wrote he wrote his other philosophical treatise, Dokodo, which talks about things of the way of walking alone, accept everything is the way it is, don't seek to possess either goods or feasts for your old age, respect Buddha, really just things about being peace of mind and being humble and things like that. And here's an example of Nitin Ichiryu. You can see the emphasis on the two-sword style. The next individual we're going to look at is Itosai. And yes, this is from a manga, but this is a manga about Itosai, who was a historical figure. And he was himself a very accomplished duelist. He learned Chujo Ryu from a renowned samurai at the time, Kanamaki Jisai, and he holds the record for the second most undefeated duels after Miyamoto Musashi. He was undefeated in 33 duels, and he is the founder of Ito Ryu, or one-stroke, one-sword school of sword fighting, renowned for drawing the sword and cutting down an enemy in one stroke. And here's Kanamaki Jisai. And then here are some examples of Ito Ryu. And then he also had a fellow student. So Kanamaki Jisai did not just teach Itosai. Another accomplished student of Itosai is an individual by the name of Sasuke Kojiro. Also, let's pause a second. Anyone notice how the hands on that statue are in the wrong position? Anyways, Sasuke Kojiro, who himself was a very renowned swordsman. And a very renowned student of Kanamaki Jisai. He is known for his specialization with the nodachi, or this very long sword that was specifically meant for killing horses. And he is even more well known for his development of what is known as the swallow cut technique, which was created supposedly in 1605 CE and supposedly mimicked the motion of a swallow's tail during flight, as observed at Kinetaibashi Bridge in Iwakuni. And it was repeatedly so quick and precise that it could strike down a bird in mid-flight. Now, while this technique is mentioned in sources of the time, there are no manuals left over from Kojiro Saseki talking about how to use it. However, these mentions talk about how it was similar to other techniques current at the time, such as Ito Ryu's Kinshi Cho Oken and the Ganryu Kosetsu To, which were, both involve fierce, swift cuts downwards, then immediately upwards. And of course, as you can see, it being similar to Ito Ryu is not surprising. After all, Kojiro Saseki and Ito Otosai both were taught by the same man, Kanamaki Jisai. So it makes sense that they would take this training and develop similar techniques. So with all this in mind, it's assumed, based off of reconstruction using these two techniques mentioned here, that, and of course this is not 100%, and no one will ever know 100% sure if this is how it worked, but this is as close as we'll get, and it's hypothesized that the technique involves striking downward from above, then instantly striking upward from below, and then the second base could be from below toward the rear, and then upward at an angle like an eagle climbing, and yada yada yada. So in other words, just coming up and down and things like that. And again, we may never know if this is it, but it's the closest we got. And he would eventually actually be the final duel that Miyamoto Musashi would fight. He would actually die at the hands of Musashi. And the story goes is that Musashi not only arrived late to the duel, but he, knowing that Kojiro Saseki was renowned for his skill with the Nodachi, Miyamoto Musashi, being sort of the sneaky individual that he was, because, again, most samurai before the codification of Bushido were perfectly okay with sneak attacks and things like that. So Miyamoto Musashi would actually take an oar that was longer than the Nodachi and would carve it into a bokken, or a training sword. And so when they swung at each other, supposedly, of course this could be just hyperbole after the fact, supposedly the oar hit Kojiro Saseki first before the Nodachi hit Miyamoto Musashi, and that resulted in the death of Kojiro Saseki. And here's sort of an image of the oar. And then the last two individuals we're going to look at are Yagyu Munenori and Yagyu Jubei Mitsuyoshi. Yagyu Munenori being here on the left, and Jubei being on the right. So Munenori was a master of one of the oldest Japanese sword styles, Yagyu Shinkake Ryu, and he was a very loyal samurai who fought for Ieyasu at the Battle of Sekigahara, and for his loyalty, he was made the official sword instructor and was made a minor daimyo. Sorry, the shogun's official sword instructor, and made a minor daimyo. And he actually had a domain of up to 10,000 koku. Again, it was showing how productive the domain was in terms of agriculture. And he would go on to train 3 successive shoguns, Ieyasu, Hidetada, and Iemitsu. And he would also author a book known as the Hereditary Book on the Art of War. And he would die eventually in 1646 CE. Jubei, on the other hand, would become an attendant in the court of the second Tokugawa shogun, Hidetada, and would become a sword instructor for the third shogun, Iemitsu, officially filling his father's role in 1616 CE. However, he would, in 1631, would step down from his position, give his position back to his father, and he would embark on what is known as a Musha Shugyo, or a warrior's pilgrimage, and would not be seen again for another 12 years. He would then reappear at the age of 36 at a demonstration of swordsmanship in front of the shogun. Following this exhibition, Jubei would be reinstated and would serve for a short time as a government inspector, taking control over his father's lands until Munenori died in 1646 CE. and he would author a book known as The Art of Looking at the Moon, and he would eventually die shortly after his father, only 4 years later, in 1650, while falcon hunting. Now, I was not able to find any translations of The Art of Looking at the Moon, or any examples, pictorial examples. I was able to find Japanese examples, but they're not particularly helpful in sussing out Jubei's philosophy. So there's that. However, based on the similarity of their titles and based on the fact that they both Jubei and Munenori practice the same sword style, it can be assumed that they had similar philosophies. For example, a hereditary book on the art of war is divided into 3 chapters. There's the Killing Sword, which addresses forces a remedy for attack. The Life-Giving Sword, a way of preventing conflict, and No Sword, like how to use the environment to your advantage. Like, for example, how uneven terrain can make all the difference in a battle, and how a loose stone can turn the table on your enemy. Yeah. So with that, we're going to move away from the social aspects of the Edo period of the Tokugawa Shogunate, and we're going to move on to the more industrial aspects, the infrastructure aspects, and we're going to take a look at urbanization in the Edo period. So during the Edo period, many of these cities, such as Edo and other castle cities, actually began to expand and witness a great amount of urbanization. They actually began to become huge metropolises. Again, as we talked about earlier, there were entire sections where there were like 4,000 women who were dedicated to either cooking or prostitution. There were entire small miniature cities of merchants, which altogether came together to make these cities massive in their own rights. In fact, the number of castles in Japan during this time began to expand. You can sort of see this map here. And of course, along with the increase in the size of cities came the increase in population. Here's a very populous and diverse, diverse is a little bit of a misnomer, but a very populous and cramped market in, I believe this is in Edo. And then, of course, you saw an increase in trade between various different castle towns, and of course a little bit of an increase in trade between China, Korea, and the Dutch that you see here. We also, this time period also witnesses the construction of several highways, known as the 5 highways, or the Gokaido, that you see here, that were mainly centered in the center of Japan, like you see here, from, like, say, Kyoto to Edo, or from other places like the Date domain to Edo, etc., etc. Key word, they were all built with the idea of allowing people to better get to Edo, or the de facto capital of Japan. But even with that aside, it doesn't take away the fact that these are good examples of the type of urbanization that was happening in Edo, Japan at the time. A type of urbanization that actually allowed for better travel between various cities within Tokugawa Japan. And of course, with that in mind, we need to look at the economy of Japan. We need to look at what allowed for this urbanization to happen. So, first of all, with the currency, we need to look at the currency of Edo, Japan. So Edo, Japan was divided. It had a currency that was divided into various different examples. Of course, you had the Kanban gold coins that you see here, which were the highest, and then below them were smaller Ichibun silver coins and smaller gold coins that you see here. Here's the smaller gold coins, and there are the Ichibun coins, and of course they could be exchanged for Mexican silver coins that were traded at Nagasaki. So, for example, 4 silver coins equaled 12 Ichiban silver coins, and 12 Ichiban silver coins equaled. Sorry, 4 Ichiban silver coins equaled 3 Kanban coins, and on and on and on. And of course, these coins evolved over the 250 years, a little longer than that, but 250 years that the Edo period existed in. But with that in mind, the primary backbone of the Edo period economy was farming, specifically rice farming, which made up 80% of the economy. And this agriculture had positive and negative aspects. Of course, it allowed for village autonomy and family farming. Acreage rose and then stabilized. Productivity rose continuously. Technology and knowledge improved over time. I mean, you see things like grist mills, water wheels, etc., etc. And of course, as commercial crops increased, some peasants became rich farmers. But it also meant, and this is where the negatives come in, it meant farmers were tied to the land and had to pay heavy taxes. And in times of famine, discontent rose, and this discontent could lead to rebellions. And there were small scale rebellions that happened during the Edo period, but none of them reached the height of the Shimabara rebellion. They were all much smaller. Though it is also important to note that about the other 20% of the economy was based off of things like fishing, craft production, and trade. And here are some of the markets that facilitated that. And here's sort of an example, look at sort of the budget money and inflation. Rice, tax from land, mining profits, merchants, etc., etc. So now, after we've looked at the urbanization and economy of the Edo period, it's now time to take a look at the Edo period's education. And there were several different types of schools. The most common types of schools were the private primary schools, which were generally taught at home and were taught to any child who could study, say ages 7 to 13, and generally taught very limited curriculums like writing and arithmetic, and they had monthly examinations and such. And generally started at 8 a.m. and ended at 2 and things like that, and they could take holidays off. And then you had the much more strict the much more strict and really the much more sought after schools, the Bukh schools or the official schools, which taught core curriculums based off of Confucianism and Chinese philosophy, and emphasized things like respect for elders, the role and duties of rulers, rituals and ceremonies, and the studies consisted of Chinese literature, memorizing and interpreting the meaning of these literatures. But they also taught Dutch Western medicine, Dutch language, Western medicine, and military navigation, etc., etc. Hence why they were much more sought after, but also much more class associated, rather than the Terracotta private primary schools, which were where most people would go to. And of course, there were quite a few different Bakufu schools. You had the Kangi Inn, apologies for possibly butchering that, which was established in 1817. It actually stayed an academy even after the fall of the Tokugawa Shogunate. And then you also had the Tekijuko, which was established by a medical doctor and Dutch scholar in Osaka, and about 30,000 students studied from 1838 to 1862 and had quite a few famous graduates. So did the Kangi Inn. So now that we've looked at the economy, urbanization, the different social classes, as well as the different activities that samurai look to in response to their loss of warfare, now it is time to take a look at Edo period art, because of course this was a time of peace and prosperity, and during times like that, art and other things like literature tend to flourish. So during the Edo period, you begin to see the production of very beautiful pieces of art, whether it be paper, paper screens with beautiful views of urban scenery, like the pleasures at Itsukushima Shrine over here on the left, or whether it be scenes of people enjoying festivals, like the painting titled "Watching Fireworks on the River." You also see beautiful animal paintings develop, such as Ogata Korin's Cranes, Pines, and Bamboo, or Suzuki Kitsu's just simply titled Cranes. And of course, you see a lot of different, a lot of other types of art produced during this time period as well. Beautiful porcelains like the one on the left, and of course, various different kinds of lacquer work that you see here on the right. And as I said at the beginning of this, much like art, literature and poetry flourished during this time period as well. So you begin to see during this time period various different novels and memoirs published and written by scholars, such as The Narrow Road to Oku in the Deep North by Matsuo Basho, or Shank's Mare by Jippensha Iku. You also begin to see the rise in popularity of haiku poetry, such as by authors such as Basho and Busan that you see here. And of course, you begin to see the development of new forms of entertainment and social life. For example, bathhouses began to increase in number during this period of time. Bathhouses that were used by both men and women, and are still used in Japan to this day. You also begin to see the creation and the increase of kabuki theaters, like you see here, with kabuki being founded by an individual known as Izumo no Okuni in the 1600s CE. Here's the individual you see here. This is also the time period that geisha began to increase in number. Geisha being courtesans who, how to phrase this? So let me put it this way. So they were courtesans who were mainly just meant to be companions. So they were, while they could most definitely participate in sex work, that was not a requirement. They were mainly people you would like say, oh, I don't want to go to a date alone. I don't want to go to, say, the theater alone. So you would hire this either a beautiful woman or a man, because unlike prostitution, geisha work was not restricted to women. Men and women could participate. And so you would hire one of these individuals to accompany you to these events, and they would entertain you, like, say, by singing poetry or dancing or something like that. It would not be sexual in nature. And despite their being cut off from the world, for the most part, Edo period Japan would see some degree of scientific and industrial development. So for one thing, you would begin to see the development of cotton weaving factories in places like Nagaya, or Owari as it's now called, and there was no steam engines or electricity, but division of labor was most definitely under the way. You'd also begin to see the production of large-scale water wheels for rice production and other grain production. You would also see a variety of mechanical instruments made that were based off of European examples, because even though the trade between Europe and Japan was restricted, that didn't necessarily stop it. So, for example, you see on the left, Wadoke, a Japanese-made clock watch, as well as a Kakakuri puppet doll over here on the right. Using mechanical power, a puppet dips a brush in ink and writes a character on paper. So there was a lot of mechanization, albeit minor, that was being developed during this time period. You also begin to see the development and improvement of scientific texts, such as based off of European science, such as Sugita Ginpaku's new text on anatomy, which was based off of Dutch anatomy books. Beforehand, Japanese anatomy books were based off Chinese and Persian anatomy books. And while they were most definitely accurate to a certain degree, by this point in time, the European anatomy books were more accurate. Though, to be fair, that's only because the Mongol Empire conquered a huge portion of Europe and the Middle East and allowed for Chinese anatomy and medical books to make it to Europe, who then, once China began to decline and not produce as much scientific work, Europe began to catch up, because actually for millennia, up until around really the 1800s, the mid, well, let's put it this way, maybe more like the early 1700s to the 1800s, that's when European powers began to catch up. You also begin to see the authorship of a variety of different books based off of animals and the natural world, such as Kitagawa Utamaru's insect book, where you see all kinds of very beautiful and very detailed depictions and descriptions of insects and their lifespans, as well as what is known as the Illustrated Book of Fish and Aquatic Animals, that was compiled by Matsudara Yoritaka, the Lord of Takamatsu, in the 1700s. That's where you get to see very beautiful and detailed paintings of various different species of shark, and to me, the most beautiful picture in these examples, the pictures of jellyfish that you see here. Now it is time to look at the religions of Japan. So generally, the two main religions of Japan during the Edo period were Buddhism and Shintoism, with Buddhism, of course, coming to Japan from China and India, and Shintoism coming from it being the indigenous Japanese religion that was mainly based off of nature worship and fertility cults, but it did also mix with Zen Buddhism. And so because of this, you had a variety of different deities present in Japan. You had Buddhist deities like Bishmonten here on the left, and Kannon in the center right, who was based off of the Bodhisattva Guanyin. But you also had native Japanese deities, such as the dragon sea deity Ryujin and the sun deity Amaterasu. And it's also important to note that despite the heavy persecution, Christians still existed in Japan at the time. In fact, they got really good at hiding their Christianity. For example, you see a Buddhist statue here, and it's a little hard to see, but hidden behind the Buddhist statue is a crucifix, and then also you had the Virgin Mary combined here. You can see the cross here with Kannon or Kuan Yin. Now we need to take a look at sort of the last example of Tokugawa expansion outside of Japan, which is the Matsumae expansion into Hokkaido and contact with the Ainu. So, beginning in the early 1600s, a small domain was given to the Matsumae family on the southernmost tip of the island Hokkaido, which was at this point in time not part of Japan. And of course, the Matsumae clan wasted no time in building themselves a little small kingdom. They built themselves a fortified castle town that eventually became a prominent and prosperous trade center. And the main reason they expanded into Hokkaido was because of Hokkaido's abundance in natural resources, particularly gold, which is still heavily abundant, and this is actually a modern map, but it's a good example of sort of the gold resources that are present within Hokkaido. So, of course, the Matsumae clan wanted to take advantage of and monopolize gold mining in the area. But it meant that they also came into contact with the Ainu people, who were the native inhabitants of Hokkaido and the islands of Sakhalin and Kamchatka, and also for a good chunk of time, they were descended from the original inhabitants of Honshu, the Emishi, who eventually migrated and intermarried with pre-existing peoples in Hokkaido and to become the Ainu. And here again is the three main settlements of the Ainu. And the Ainu were hunter-gatherer societies, and they were very skilled, known for being very skilled hunters, as you can see here, and very skilled fishers. And of course, by that logic, because of their skill with the bow and the spear, they were also very skilled fighters. They also practiced a religion very similar to Shintoism, but not the same. I want to preface that they are not the same as Shintoism, but it's very similar. They worshipped nature spirits, and they would practice ceremonies like where they would raise a bear from a young age, and then once it reached a certain age, they would sacrifice the bear to return it to the spirit world. It was seen as sort of a very high honor for the bear. And they would be sort of like Ryukyu would be sort of the middlemen for a lot of trade in the area, where they would trade as far north as Kamchatka and Sakhalin, and then would bring trade goods back to Hokkaido to trade with the Matsumae domain. And so Ainu trade goods would be things like sea otter pelts, fox pelts, eagle feathers, and live eagles, which they would trade in return for Japanese silk, cotton textiles, swords, and pots and lacquerware. However, it's also important to note, and really unfortunately unsurprising, that unsurprising to know that the Japanese, particularly the Matsumae, would heavily mistreat the Ainu. For one thing, they would often depict the Ainu as sort of, barbaric, subhuman, when of course they weren't at all anything like that. It's very similar to, say, how the Native Americans were depicted by Americans and British, very horrible racist views that they depicted here. And they were also often degraded because they were forced to send emissaries to Edo, and they were forced to do the kowtow, or forced to bow and submit themselves to the Tokugawa Shogunate, oftentimes in full Ainu garb, regardless of whether or not they were. Some Ainu actually did adopt Japanese clothing willingly, and even if they did that, they were still required to wear their traditional garb as a form of, denoting their otherness. But one of the side effects of this trade and also of this mistreatment led to the creation of both larger tribal groups, as smaller tribal groups began to band together in order to better manipulate the natural resources of the region for trade. But it would also lead to scarcity of resources, which would lead to conflicts between these tribal groups. And so, in short, what this meant is at this point in time, the Matsumae clan would actually go directly to the Ainu clans for trade goods and for trade. And so this in itself is what facilitated the eventual sort of unification of the various different village societies and tribal societies and such of the Ainu into more and more cohesive singular groups. And it was actually one of these conflicts over scarce resources that eventually led to conflict with Japan, a conflict that became known as Shakushan's Revolt. So this revolt started actually as an intertribal warfare when one Ainu clan actually supposedly went into the domain of a clan led by Shakushane and began hunting the deer and other animals on their land. And this angered Shakushane, who began to conduct warfare and raids against this other clan. And this eventually culminated in him hunting down the leaders of this clan and surrounding them while they were inside a Japanese gold mining camp, and he would slaughter all of them and the Japanese inside them. And with this, he sort of realized that, well, I guess the cat's out of the bag. War with Japan is sort of inevitable now. So he gathered up a coalition of around 16 to 19 other Ainu clans and began to conduct warfare and raids against every Japanese camp he could. And you can actually see sort of the swath of destruction that they caused. Now, of course, this was understandable. While it did cause a lot of destruction, we have to understand that they were often mistreated by the Japanese. It was because of the Japanese that their hunting grounds were becoming more and more scarce. They had less and less food, and also smallpox was wreaking havoc in Ainu communities because of the Japanese. So a whole slew of factors alongside the intertribal warfare is what led Shakushane to decide he's had enough of Japan. However, in response to these raids, the Matsumae clan would gather a large army and arm them heavily. Here's sort of some of the tables showing the amount of men that the Matsumae domain had at their disposal to put against the Ainu. And here's some more. And you can see sort of like 60 units of Ashigaru, all kinds of things. They have, 900 pieces of guns, et cetera, et cetera. And they brought the full brunt of their domain military against the Ainu. And they fought a variety of different battles, wreaking havoc on the Ainu themselves, whether they were on the side of Shakushane or not. And eventually, Shakushane had enough of this warfare, and he actually offered to surrender and offered to sign a peace treaty with the Matsumae domain. And the Matsumae clan was like, sure, we'll sign a peace treaty with you. And then they lured him and his inner circle to this area known as Bikubo, and then proceeded to slaughter them while they were unarmed, therefore ending Shokushane's rebellion. In the aftermath of this, the Matsumae clan and the Tokugawa Shogunate put in new institutions. One, they built a variety of different trading posts in the area. And two, they made it to where they no longer went to the Ainu. They forced the Ainu to come to them, to their trading posts, which you can see here. So this meant that the Ainu were now much more divided than they were even before the Matsumae clan got there, especially more divided than when Shakushane and these various unified tribal groups were coalescing into a confederation. But this was not the end of Ainu resistance against Japan. There would be one final event known as the Minashi Kunashir Rebellion in 1789 CE. And it was started because it was believed that an Ainu chief was maybe poisoned by the Matsumae clan. Whether or not that happened, who knows? But the small clan did rise up against the Matsumae clan, and they were quickly put down, and it resulted in the deaths of around 37 Ainu. And this was the final death knell of Ainu resistance against Japan for a while. All right, so now that we've taken a look at that, now it is time to look at the end of Japanese isolation. So, despite its attempts to isolate itself from the outside world, Japan was aware of goings-ons in the outside world and were aware of other nations. And as along with that, other nations would actually attempt to end Japanese isolation. The first of which was the Russian Empire. And this is because as the Russian Empire began to expand across Siberia and into East Asia, they of course came into contact with the Ainu in Sakhalin and Kamchatka, among other places. And so, and by proxy, came into contact with Japan. And then this contact led to Russia attempting to establish relations between the Russian Empire and Japan, with these attempts ranging from 1778 to 1811 CE. The first of which being the Pavel expedition, or the Pavel-Lebedev Letstochkin expedition, say that 20 times fast, in 1778. Which led, which essentially it was very uneventful. Pavel landed with his crew, brought some gifts to the Matsumae clan, attempted to negotiate for trade relations between Russia and Japan. The Matsumae clan was like, no, we're not interested. Trade is only allowed in Japan with foreign powers through Nagasaki. If you want to trade, go there. And then they sent them on their merry way, though the Pavel expedition did return some Japanese sailors who had when their ships had gone down, they had been washed ashore onto Russian shores. Then, a little over 10 years later, came the Adam Laxman expedition in 1792 CE. And Adam Laxman would try to repeat, would try to succeed where Pavel failed, and he would go to Japan, trying to open up trade, also bringing Japanese castaways that you can see here on the right. However, he would also be sent away. He would be given a little more formal decree saying that the Russians could trade in Nagasaki before, officially saying they could trade there, when before it had been officially only the Dutch. But other than that, he really had no successes. Then there was also the Nikolai Rezanov expedition in 1804 that also had very similar results. He was also told, sorry, we're not interested. He actually didn't even get the forms that the other two got. Then the final attempt happened with the capture of Vasily Vasily Golovinin, apologies for butchering that, who actually, with permission from the Russian Science Academy, began to sort of sail around and try to map the Japanese islands. However, he was captured by Japanese authorities and held in captivity for around 18 months, which you can see here. And he, again, left with little to no. He was eventually set free, and he again was not able to get any kind of concessions. And then Russia after that sort of lost interest until around the 1850s, when they heard another power was beginning to think about opening Japan and gaining trade concessions. But while they were beginning to regain interest, they never actually got around to it, whereas the other power they heard about that was trying to open Japan, the U.S., succeeded. And this is where we look at when the U.S. Navy forced Japan to end its isolation. So Japan's isolation came to an end when the U.S. government sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan to forcibly open it up to trade relations. And this was done for a variety of reasons. One, U.S. sailors who had sailed around Japan in preceding years had been captured. Some had been executed, some had been sent on their way. But also, the U.S. was very interested in opening up Japan because Britain had previously, in 1842, succeeded in forcibly opening China up to European trade. So the U.S. was like, we're not going to let them beat us. We're not going to let them be richer than us. So they sent Commodore Perry to open up Japan in 1853 to 1854. And you can see one of the very advanced ironclad ships that he brought with him. Yeah. And he would proceed to land in Japan, and it would be during this time, during this visit, that it would become abundantly clear to the Tokugawa Shogunate that they were heavily outmatched at this point in time by the U.S. Army. And so they were like, all right, fine, we'll end our isolation. We'll end it. And it was not, that's a little oversimplification. There was some debates. Some of the more conservative members didn't want to do that. But the more liberal members, the members who were like, yeah, we don't want to be invaded by a much more advanced power like China was, because, again, they were not ignorant of the world. They had heard about the Opium War through trade with the Dutch at Nagasaki and through trade with China at Nagasaki. So they're like, we don't want to be another China. Fine, we'll let you in. And so eventually this led to, 4 years later, a treaty known as the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which the most important points were exchange of diplomatic agents. Edo, Kobe, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Yokohama were opened as foreign trade ports. U.S. citizens could live and trade at will in those ports. Only the opium trade was prohibited. Extraterritoriality was allowed for U.S. citizens, i.e., it meant that U.S. citizens could only be tried by U.S. law if they committed crimes in Japan, not Japanese law. They had low import-export duties, and they had it allowed for the ability for Japan to purchase American shipping and weapons, which actually will become very important in later videos in the series. And with that ends the video on the Tokugawa Shogunate. I know it was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things. If you want to see me cover any of the other subjects in this video in greater detail in other videos, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.